Hi there, class. Welcome to lecture number 2. To start with, I'm going to show an ad from Under Armour, which I referenced in the current events discussion this week. New advertising rules were in place for the Olympics last year in Rio, and these rules allowed advertisers to run ads during the Olympics, even if they weren't actual Olympic sponsors. So the requirement was that they had a relationship with the athlete that originated 6 months prior to the games. And so Under Armour sponsored my swimmer Michael Phelps prior to the games, then made a killing running the following ad during the Olympics without being an official Olympic sponsor. So here we go.
It's the last goodbye, I swear. I have no regrets, for the past is behind me. Tomorrow reminds me just where. Can't quite see the end. How can I rely on my heart if I break it with my own 2 hands? I heard all you said, don't say anything. It's the last goodbye, I swear.
So I think Under Armour really nailed it with this ad. I mean, you kind of feel Phelps's journey, his pain, and whatever magical swimming mojo it was that made him turn into a bearded yeti before he shaved it all off to win more Olympic medals than any other human being in history. So great marketing strategy by Under Armour and taking advantage of new international and Olympic advertising regulations. So we're going to talk about various aspects of international economics in this lecture. So let me introduce Dr. Thomas Sowell. He's a professor of economics at Stanford and probably one of the great contemporary economic thinkers. So he's saying here, we cannot opt out of economic issues and decisions. Our only options are to be informed, uninformed, or misinformed. So that said, let's launch into Chapter 2, the dynamic environment of international trade. So here's the Cliff Notes. These are the things that I want to make sure that you understand. These are the things I'm trying to teach. And now to kick this conversation off, as we look at international trade, we need to take a look at a little bit of history, beginning with the concept of the gold standard. So the gold standard is the idea that each note, right? So each piece of currency in a country is backed by a hard asset, which derives its value, or which has intrinsic value. It's not derived from any of the aspects of a particular country. So in this example, we're talking about gold. So here's a big pile of gold. Prior to 1900, the most common form of international exchange was gold. There are some historical examples of other types of exchange, but for our purposes, basically before 1900, gold is how international trade was done. There wasn't a marketplace for the exchange of one nation's currency with another's. So gold was the whole underpinning of international trade. In 1913, the Federal Reserve is created, formed by Congress to be the central bank of the United States. So its mission is to control inflation by stabilizing the price of gold in relationship to the currency. And U.S. banknotes are then tied to gold. Now, World War I kind of throws the global economy into shambles, and the gold standard is temporarily suspended. In the UK, this is John Maynard Keynes. He kind of becomes the rock star economist in this period of time leading up to World War II. Keynes had a few kind of key tenets, one of which was the paradox of thrift. Essentially, this said that people save their money, like say they stuff all their money in a mattress, which would be good according to the conventional wisdom of, hey, a penny saved is a penny earned. But Keynes is saying, look, this savings removes money from the economy, and that reduces the number of transactions that can happen in the economy and reduces the overall economy's ability to grow. As a result, Keynes championed increasing the number of transactions in an economy by injecting more money into it, even if that money was borrowed. So Keynes became the father of economic stimulus. The idea is that if a business or a government were given the money, or even individual citizens were given money to spend, that would increase their demand for goods and services. So that's why this is called demand-side economics. And that demand would in turn drive up transactions in the economy, and the economic growth that the country would see would benefit the economy more than the cost of the debt. Now, all the while Keynes' ideas are picking up momentum. In 1929, we see the stock market crash, Black Thursday. And this is the harbinger of the Great Depression in America. So it really rocks people's faith in kind of a bedrock principle of American economics, which is free markets. Now, FDR then comes along and runs for election based on his promise that he's going to help people out of the Depression, and he wins. So, but as soon as he gets into office, things are not actually getting better; they're getting worse. As the Depression worsens, this is in the days before you had FDIC insurance on your deposits at banks. So the value of the money you put in a bank depended on the bank being solvent itself. So banks start to go out of business as a result of the Depression, and people are losing faith in them. You get this run on the banks, right? The same story you see in A Wonderful Life, right? When everybody's running on the bank and Jimmy Stewart's trying to tell them where all their money is and each other's home mortgages and whatever else. So people are running on the bank, redeeming their currency for gold. So FDR steps in. He steps in and immediately closes all the banks and sends out an order that banks are to return their gold reserves to the Federal Reserve. At the same time, he issues a patriotic call to all Americans to turn in the gold that they redeemed for U.S. dollars. In addition to that, it becomes illegal to export gold outside the country. All of the gold that is redeemed from the banks is stored and stockpiled at Fort Knox. Now, in order to restore a little bit of faith in the stock market, two acts are passed, the Securities Act and the Securities and Exchange Act, which creates the SEC. And these are all part of FDR's New Deal. Following the Securities Act, FDR passes the 1934 Gold Reserve Act. This makes it illegal to own gold without a license. Now, these policies bring a measure of stability, but near the end of FDR's presidency, the U.S. gets drawn into World War II by the attack on Pearl Harbor. This is the attack where FDR gives his famous speech stating that December 7th, 1941 is a date that will live in infamy, as he talks about the United States being attacked by the Empire of Japan. Now, with the fast forward to the end of the war, this actually happened before all of the war was officially over, but the writing was on the wall. So with the end of the war in sight, key nations gather for what was called the Bretton Woods Agreements. There had been a lot of loans between allied countries, and there's some serious questions about how international trade is going to resume after the war. So Keynes is the representative from Great Britain. He's their key economist. And he proposes that a brand new currency be set up, and that currency be tied to gold and become the medium for international exchange. So the gold standard gets revived. Now, at the last minute, the U.S. representative at Bretton Woods was a guy named Harry Dexter White. Interestingly, this guy would later be accused of spying for the Russians. But in this effort, it seems that he had U.S. interests at heart. He, at the last minute, substitutes the new currency that Keynes proposed and just puts in the U.S. dollar. So as a result of the signatures coming out of the Bretton Woods agreements, the U.S. dollar becomes de facto the reserve currency used by essentially all the major countries in the world. Now, Keynes dies shortly after the war, but his ideas and his economic principles become official U.S. economic policy for almost 50 years. Now, the gold standard didn't last quite as long. During Richard Nixon's presidency, foreign governments, led principally by France, began high-volume redemptions of notes for gold. And so they're effectively hoarding gold. Now, whether there's justification for why they wanted to do this or not, the basic effect was that weakened the U.S. economic position. So as a result, Nixon nixed the gold standard and established that the United States dollar would become a fiat currency, no longer backed by gold. Instead, its value was backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. Now, as a result of that, this did not go down easy. There was some panic and volatility, a minor depression in the economy ensued, but eventually that settled out, and the U.S. dollar remained the dominant reserve currency in the world. Today, the U.S. dollar is still the major reserve currency in the world, with the euro as the number 2 currency. Now, while there are some negatives to dollars no longer being backed by gold, there are positives as well. So let's take a look at these two as if this was an entire economy. So there's an economy of two people. In this economy, they want to trade. And so they have enough dollars and enough gold behind those dollars to do all the trading they want. They can trade with each other every year. And everything is hunky-dory until we get a new person in the economy. Now, there's not enough money supply to facilitate all the transactions that want to happen. Since we don't have any more gold, this means that the growth of this little mini economy is constrained. With a fiat currency, so not tied to gold, we can just print another dollar and let the economy grow as much as it wants. The risk there is that if the money supply grows faster than GDP, so GDP is how we measure the total number of transactions that want to take place in an economy, then the supply gets bigger than demand, and that means the price of a dollar goes down. In other words, we have inflation, and dollars don't buy as much. Now, two other things that come out of the Bretton Woods talks there at the end of World War II are the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. These are two global financial institutions that still exist today. The IMF was designed to be a stabilizing force in the global economy, while the World Bank was designed to provide economic development resources like loans to poor countries. With that historical context, let's jump into a discussion of the modern elements of international trade. So another little historical sidebar. So we talked about kind of post-World War II. We got the Bretton Woods agreements, new gold standard, new reserve currency with the U.S. dollar for international trade, and a mechanism for foreign exchange. So with that, U.S. companies start to grow. And in the intervening years, in the 1950s and 60s, you see U.S. companies, especially the big multinationals, have both the means and the appetite to expand their reach overseas. Their expansion during this period, the reason this piece of history is important is because as they're doing this, the trade relations and things that they establish still impact how trade is done in these areas today, especially in Europe and Latin America. Now, an example of reaction to these multinationals is that in Europe, the public sentiment against the influence of these rich American companies created conditions where European countries passed laws that limited the amount of foreign investment that would be allowed. In Latin America, you have the the principle of expropriation. So American companies might build factories and then have them expropriated or confiscated by the local government. That's a pretty big deal when somebody can just come along and take your stuff. So those actions force the American companies to kind of consider the risk reward involved in putting investment into foreign markets. We saw this same slide in Chapter 1 where we were looking at the percentage of revenue that these big companies were deriving from foreign investment. But this week, this slide serves just to underscore, why would companies take the risk? Why would they? Risk is something that businesses hate. Well, here's the reason. They take the risk because there's a lot of big, fat, juicy reward attached. The companies on this list are earning hundreds of billions of dollars from their efforts in foreign markets. Here's a slide that kind of illustrates the evolution of U.S. dominance as multinational, U.S. dominance in being the home country for multinational corporations over time. These are the top 100 largest companies in the world based on their revenues, and this is a 2012 snapshot. Take a look at the U.S. Back in 1963, 67 of the top 100 companies were based in the U.S. Now that number is like half of what it was, right? We're 2014, that's 3 years ago, we were at 34. As you go down the list, these other countries don't have near the presence of the U.S., but when we get to the bottom of the list, here's China, probably the next most interesting player. And you can see that in 1963, China had zero. Zero out of the top 100 companies were Chinese. But since 2000, they have been steadily growing, and now, as of 2014, may even be bigger now. As of 2014, you had 15 of the top 100 companies came from China, which is bigger than anybody else currently. With that said, let's talk about balance of payments. The balance of payments is an accounting record of the total financial transactions of consumers, businesses, and governments between countries. Balance of payments is recorded using a double entry accounting system. In other words, when a transaction happens, one side of the ledger is credited, the other side is debited. This is, if you've already had to take some managerial accounting in your business classes or whatnot, this is consistent with basic professional accounting practices. Now, within the balance of payments, there's actually three separate accounts. There's the current account, which records basically imports and exports. The capital account, which is where investments and capital holdings are reported. And then the reserve account, which shows the balance of the reserve currency. This is where, if I have gold that I'm using as reserve, or if I have US dollars or euros, this is where those are reported. And really, the current account is the one that we're most interested in. Here's a look at the U.S. current account as of 2011. Notice that there's a deficit. There at the bottom, we're at negative $473 billion as of 2011. Now, within the current account is what's called the balance of trade. And this is just a simplified look at the trade scenario, focusing only on goods and services imported and exported. If a country imports more than it exports, then that means it has a trade deficit. That's the situation the U.S. is in with that negative $400 billion. If it exports more than it imports, that's called a trade surplus. So let's take a look at the type of things that are included. Receipts represent money coming into the country versus payments. So money going versus payments, which is money leaving the country. An example of receipts include if we export goods to another country, the payment for them, right, the money that comes in, is a receipt. When foreigners visit the U.S. and spend money that they earned in their home country, that's money coming into the U.S. from the foreign country. If they fly to the U.S. and the cost of travel is domesticated to the U.S., that's money flowing in. If a U.S. company makes a foreign direct investment in another country, so they go out, they build a factory or they hire workers, that's money that... if a foreign company, I was like, I thought that doesn't sound right. If a foreign company makes a direct investment in the U.S., so a foreign company hires somebody in the U.S. or builds a factory, otherwise generates money, then that... I've screwed this up. U.S. company investing in a foreign market, and that investment pays off. They make money from that investment. The money they make is a receipt to the U.S. And then foreign investments in the U.S., so if a foreign company comes to the U.S. and hires somebody or builds a product, then that is money that's going into the U.S. from that foreign market. So I guess hiring somebody doesn't really work. But if they come in and they build a factory, then the workers that are local are getting paid with money that was came from a foreign market. And so that becomes a receipt a receipt to the U.S. Now, the reverse right payments. I should mention that Trump's made a lot of comments about lowering the tax rates for U.S. companies that are bringing dividends and interest from foreign investments back to the U.S. So because you have to pay a tax when you bring money back to the country, a lot of people are leaving it. And this is individuals, companies. They're leaving that money in the foreign market. If they can put it back to work there, great, but they don't want to pay the tax. So Trump is saying, well, hey, we're going to lower the tax rate, and that's going to create an incentive for U.S.-based individuals and companies to bring their money back to the U.S., and that the influx of that cash will improve the economy here in the United States. That's his idea. Whether that happens or not, funds that enter the U.S. like that, those are receipts. And then finally, when a foreign company payments, on the other hand, represent money that leaves the U.S. into the foreign markets. When goods are imported, they're paid for with U.S. dollars that flow out of the U.S. into the foreign market. Just like foreigners spend money when they visit the U.S., when U.S. tourists visit overseas, they spend U.S. dollars overseas, and that's money that goes out of the U.S. into foreign markets. And then the where I stumbled over my words is investment by companies, right? If a foreign company builds something in the U.S. and it generates returns, the returns go back to the foreign country, and those are outflows from the U.S. And likewise, if U.S. companies go and pay to build something in a foreign country, those investments are outflows of cash from the U.S. to the foreign country. And then finally, military and economic aid. So the U.S. is the largest donor of economic aid in the world. The largest. No other country donates more aid. You have to get all of the countries of Europe together to get more aid than what the United States gives to other countries. But those gifts of aid represent outflows or payments in the balance of trade. Now, early in the history of the United States, it often had a trade surplus, exported more goods than it imported. But by 1971, it generated a deficit of about $2 billion. Well, that's kind of a lot. But if you look at 16 years in the future, that had ballooned to $160 billion. So here's a chart that shows the historical U.S. trade balance. So you see how early on it was pretty even, but in recent times the deficit just continues to grow, and it's getting steeper and steeper. Now the deficit did peak in 2007, so we're talking about fairly recent times, and where the economic crisis essentially sucker punched the dollar, and that caused the deficit to drop almost in half. And here you can see where that is. But you can see, even though that was a really sharp decrease, we've kind of been working our way back up to where we were before in the intervening years. So it's not like that we had a reversal of trade policy. We just had a financial crisis that sucked the wind out of our ability to generate deficits. Now, one of the things to know about deficits is that they increase pressure to devalue the dollar. How come? Well, let's say that you've got a company and you're making something in the U.S., but you want to sell it in Europe. So the price of it in dollars is $100. If the dollar is strong against the euro, that means it takes more euros for every dollar. A weak dollar means it takes less euros for every dollar. So let's say that when the dollar is strong, it means that it costs 125 euros to buy your $100 product. But when the dollar is weak, it only takes 75 euros to buy your product. So the trade deficit creates pressure to weaken the dollar in order for U.S. goods to be cheaper to overseas buyers. And the reason for that is that increases exports and it helps restore the balance of trade. Now, there's a lot of discussion about this in the press right now. Trump has said that he believes that the dollar is too strong. He wants a weaker dollar in order to encourage more exports, which would generate more sales for U.S. manufacturers. A big part of his constituencies are in the Iron Belt, American factory workers, and so he's looking at, hey, if the dollar was weaker, we would be able to generate more money, more jobs for American factory workers. Let's take a look at... Okay, these are the top trading partners with the U.S. And so you can see a balance of trade country by country. If you look up there, this is the last, the current account slide was from 2011, but here you can see this one's from 2015. So by 2015, the trade deficit in the United States went from about $400 billion to about $600 billion. Now, just a couple years ago, China passed up Canada as the as the largest trading partner with the U.S. But take a look at the dynamics. If you look at China, the trade deficit with China is about half of the overall deficit that the United States has. Where Canada, if you look at their import-export ratio, it's pretty even. The trade deficit is only $12 billion, which is a fraction of the amount you have with China. And these slides kind of illustrate this point that, even though it looks like there's a ton of John Deere tractors coming off the assembly line, they're just dwarfed by the amount of Hyundai cars that are waiting to be shipped to the U.S. Now, Hyundai is what we say here, is a Korean manufacturer, but it's the same difference. These could be iPhones sitting on the docks in China. The amount of imports to the U.S. are just outstripping exports. Now here's an interesting map. This looks at the largest export partner of every U.S. state. One of the things I think is interesting here is that in the U.S., the biggest export partner is Hong Kong, and they don't show up in any other state. Now here's the reverse, which is each state's biggest import trading partner. And again, you can note that Utah's biggest import partner is Mexico. Here's another map that shows comparison GDP. So if you took each state and compared its GDP with a foreign country, here's how they would compare. Interesting here. So Utah's GDP lines up about the same as New Zealand's. Now, I want to introduce a video about trade disputes, and so this is specifically about Hershey's and Cadbury.
Chocolate can be comforting in hard times, but if you turn to British chocolate for support, you might need to begin stockpiling fast. Vladimir Duthier is here looking at a looming ban. Vlad, good morning.
Good morning. For more than 30 years, importers of British goods brought English Cadbury chocolate into the United States. But as a lawsuit between the American chocolate behemoth Hershey and the British importers draws to a close, fans of milky English bars of chocolate are anticipating a permanent dry spell. Luscious, tempting, sinful. Chocolate is addictive. There's a reason why the world equates chocolate with love. Joe Allegretti comes to Myers of Keswick in Manhattan's West Village for his fix.
English Cadbury is better than American Cadbury. I have said that for years.
And London expat Matthew James Thomas seems to agree.
American chocolate is just not quite there yet.
Would you want these? Yeah.
With the ban against British milk chocolate looming, near panic is setting in.
We're laying our hands on all the Cadburys that we can until the ban actually takes effect.
The first ingredient listed on this, milk. Nikki Perry and her husband Sean Kavanagh Downsett own Tea and Sympathy, an English grocery and tea shop in New York City.
This is a global world now. You can't turn around to us and say all of a sudden we can't have bars of chocolate.
Hershey has owned the rights to make Cadbury in the U.S. for nearly 30 years and has largely ignored specialty shops selling the British version. But after noticing those stores were taking an increasing bite of the company's $7 billion business, Hershey sued to stop all imports into the U.S.
I actually really don't understand it because with all that's happening today, is it really that important to be banning chocolate?
Tastes like chocolate, never tasted before. Just let me know when I'm going to get arrested for selling chocolate because I would
We'd love to have you guys with the camera here.
On the camera as they lead me off for selling chocolate. This is ridiculous.
Well, they would say it's not selling chocolate. They would say that you're infringing.
Nonsense. We're not infringing on anything.
Have you ever seen fudge done this way?
Jim St. John is Senior Director of Product Development at Hershey's and says the recipes are almost identical.
I would say that the product that we sell in the United States is extremely similar to the products sold in England, and that consumers would be delighted by either.
Not so, say the lovers of British Cadburys. They point to the ingredients to make their argument. British Cadburys defines milk chocolate as milk, sugar, and then cocoa butter. The American as sugar, milk, then chocolate. Tiny differences, but they leave the British palate unsatisfied.
I don't know how you got this in.
We called on food writer and chocolate aficionado Bill Buford to put this claim to the test. First, the English Cadbury.
What are you tasting?
It tastes of milk. But if you can imagine this like as warmed up in a cup on a cold morning in the mountains, this is like the bar equivalent of a steamy cup of hot chocolate.
And it really has it sticks to the roof of your mouth. It's not very easy to swallow at first.
No.
As for the Cadbury made in the U.S.,
Well, I have to say that it's not bad.
No.
It is a subtle difference. It is a subtle difference.
It has nothing to do with what's better. It's not only personal preference, but there's also a very sentimental idea, which is that if you grew up with this,
Right.
This is England, mate.
and therein lies the issue. While the battle may be playing itself out in a Yankee court, in the end, what's at stake may really be more a matter of hearts and minds.
It's kind of like a nationalistic food. It's hot dogs on the 4th of July.
There's all sorts of reports you can read and studies where they say that chocolate triggers something in the human mind, and it releases a certain level of endorphins and it's sense memory and all these different
Tell you
things.
that chocolate's orgasmic.
Well,
Are you trying to tell me that, Sean? All right, so the final settlement in the Hershey's lawsuit will be reached in several weeks. Now, the main importers of British Cadbury chocolate will pay a fine and be banned from bringing over the chocolate, thereby ending the British threat to America's sweeter tooth. But before we go, I brought some chocolate here for everybody to try. You guys will...
Gail and I know which one is which right now, but Nora doesn't. So, okay, I know which one you're eating right there.
Well, I have something on the inside.
Well, one's English, one's American.
Yeah, you have to see if you can tell the difference. Okay, you don't like that one. Try the other one.
I'm going to guess that's the American.
It is.
Why
Which
do you
one
think
like
that?
better?
It doesn't have that stuff on the inside. I don't know. This is more sugary.
You can feel the sugar,
The
right?
American
or
one
taste the
is
sugar.
you're saying.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Right?
Nora,
Too bad you're not in charge of the court case.
It's very British.
Nora likes America. We'll be right back.
Woo, go America!
So in this example, I think it's worth a discussion about Hershey. Is Hershey doing the right thing? Right? They own the rights to Cadbury in the United States. Aren't they justified in using the court system to defend those rights? Is there something that they maybe could have chosen to do that would be less controversial? Maybe a more of a positive kind of PR campaign. Maybe they could have taken an approach that wouldn't have been as offensive to as many consumers. But here's an example of using the legal system as a barrier to just open and free trade. Now, trade barriers, countries have a lot of tools at their disposal for influencing trade. Let's take a look at some of these in a little more detail. So, two categories. There's tariff and non-tariff barriers. Tariffs have kind of become unpopular, I think mostly because they're just a straight-up tax. But non-tariff barriers are still pretty common. Here's a little example about how tariffs work. Let's say that there's textile manufacturers in the US and in the UK. Now, 1 unit of textiles can be sold for $4 in either country. However, the US wants to create a favorable condition for its manufacturer, so it imposes a $1 tariff on the imported textiles from the UK. Now, the UK textiles cost $5 in the US, and so that creates a competitive advantage for the US textiles. So assuming the same quality, everything else, the US textiles are cheaper. This is a little bit of a simplistic example because you'd likely see retaliation in the form of a similar tariff from Great Britain on the American textiles. But you get this idea of how the basic structure of how tariffs work. Now, here's a clip from the Motion Picture Hall of Fame. This is from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, talking about just how riveting a topic tariffs are.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? A tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone? Anyone? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
Okay, so thanks to Ben Stein, we are able to see that hopefully this will be a little more interesting, but tariffs are tariffs. So thanks to Ben Stein, we learned that Utah Senator Smoot co-sponsored the tariff bill after the stock market crash that single-handedly plunged the U.S. into the Great Depression. The idea behind the bill was that tariffs would increase revenue to the U.S., which would help the ailing economy. But the result was a predictable retaliation from the other countries. So U.S. puts a bunch of tariffs on imports. The other countries put a bunch of tariffs on U.S. exports. And the result is that you get a contraction of transactions in the economy. So it cripples the economy instead of helping it. Now, just real quick, here are 3 categories of things that tariffs do. They increase inflation, they put more trade under government control, they trigger these types of retaliatory tariffs, they weaken the balance of payments situation for an economy. They kind of interfere with the natural free market laws of supply and demand, and ultimately they can spark trade wars. If you happen to look at the article on Marriott in China, they're talking in this kind of language, saying that Trump's economic policies may spark a trade war with China, and what would that do to Marriott? In addition to that, they restrict competition, they restrict consumer choice, and they restrict options for where you are going to establish your supply chain as a manufacturer. So if there's a big tariff in place, then the iPhone maybe doesn't get built in China because it's no longer economically feasible for it to be done. Now, in addition to tariffs, there's a similar type of protection, which is quotas. So here we got the same textile example with the UK and the US. In this example, the U.S. Imports $3 million of textiles per year, and let's say that they impose a quota of $1 million. So this doesn't change at all the $3 million demand for the product. What it does, though, is now supply is less than demand, which has the effect of increasing the price of the UK textiles, which creates a similar advantage for the U.S. manufacturer of textiles because now their products are less expensive. So tariffs, quotas, and non-tariff barriers are really just designed to protect home markets. Since they're designed to protect, they're called protectionism. And even though the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, has helped reduce tariffs overall across the world, the idea of protectionism is still alive and well. Protectionism can have a lot of forms. It can be legal. It can be affect barriers to exchange. And there can even be psychological barriers to trade. So I've got 6 types of non-tariff barriers to give you an idea of just the breadth of kind of the lengths that countries will go to enact protectionist policies. First one is quotas. So we saw that example of the textiles. So we're going to reduce the amount we allow into the country. There are customs procedures. So everything that comes into the country has to go through customs. So you can value goods and charge duties on them. Like Israel's kind of infamous for this. They typically they take whatever it is you're coming into the country with, value it at 100% of its retail price, and then charge you tax on them. So if you go into Israel with a fancy phone or with some fancy equipment, even if you have no intention of reselling it, importing it for sale, you'll get charged a tax on its full value. And in addition to valuing things, you can add additional requirements or fees to importing. It just makes it harder. Standards. So you could say, hey, these products aren't labeled correctly. We want them to be labeled with XYZ. They're not. Or we could say that, hey, these goods don't meet the requirements that we have for sale in our local market. Maybe like this could be Japan saying, hey, U.S. beef is not as good as our Kobe beef, so we're not going to allow that into the country to compete. Using standards as, we just did standards. Government participation. So what if the government is the one who's buying? Well, if the government's buying your product, then they can create all kinds of rules for how the procurement works. And so you may have a more difficult time selling to the government than you would if the buyer was just a private party. They can also offer subsidies for exports. Countervailing duties are a type of tax that are designed to offset another country's export subsidies. So, like, let's say that you're importing a product from another country and the government is subsidizing it. Maybe this is a U.S. airline is buying Airbus planes, and Airbus is subsidized by the governments of Germany and France. Well, they may put a countervailing duty in place, which makes selling Boeing airplanes to the countries where Airbus is made make it more competitive. Or maybe a better example would be placing a tax on other things, not necessarily the airplanes themselves, but another category of products from Germany and France, but it's in retaliation for the subsidies that they're giving to their exports. We can charging all kinds of fees and taxes and payments on imports, extra fees, levies, all kinds of there are many and various the ways that governments can tax your stuff. And then finally, there's other things like voluntary export restraints. Maybe you'll have somebody come along and say, look, it's your patriotic duty to limit what you're exporting. Or as we're going to talk about in the next couple slides, maybe you create a product that has a military application, and so we're going to say, look, it's your patriotic duty not to sell that outside of the United States or whatever your home country is. So here's Trump. I don't always go for protectionism. When I do, it's to protect my people's economy and safety, of course. Here are some of the arguments. Arguments in favor of protectionism: keep jobs at home, foster fledgling domestic businesses, maybe retaliation for protectionist measures of other countries. We talked a lot about that. Some types of protection for the home market, like that the home market would be unable to be competitive without these provisions. Maybe you want to keep it. You're talking about keeping money at home, so you want to protect the domestic money supply. This is kind of the rationale that Nixon used as he left the gold standard. You may be encouraging domestic parties to accumulate capital in preparation for some future action or event that they may come across. Sometimes there's a claim that you'll protect local workers. This is actually one of Trump's claims. He's saying that hey, we're going to enact tariffs in order to protect U.S. manufacturing jobs. Could be for conservation of natural resources. For instance, African countries might be worried about China coming along and accumulating all their rare earth minerals, which is something that's happening. So they may enact laws saying, hey, we're not going to allow export of whatever the rare earth minerals are. Ultimately, national defense is probably the only real legitimate rationale for protectionism. A country may not want to export its top military technology to another country, but for the most part, these arguments are really just bad news. They don't hold up to scrutiny. So the overall, the general economic opinion is that protectionism is bad economically, that it just hurts everybody. There's also some monetary protectionist measures. So you could block a country's currency. You could say, look, it's fine, but you're no longer allowed to conduct trade in euros. So our banks will not allow you to buy products or sell them if euros is your mechanism of exchange. You could manipulate the exchange rates so that they're just unfavorable. China does this. China comes under a lot of criticism for not allowing their currency to free float. In other words, that it's the rate of exchange with the Chinese yuan to other currencies is totally controlled by the government. It is not allowed to move based on supply and demand. Or finally, you could implement a bunch of onerous rules for government approval for any of the trade that's happening. Now, so in 1988, President Reagan signed the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act. And this was kind of the first wave of kind of comprehensive legislation around trade. And what this act did, well, leading up to the act, there were free trade policies of a lot of countries, allowed other countries to trade freely with the U.S., but the U.S. didn't really enjoy all the same provisions when trading with them. So they signed this, the OTCA, to ease trade restrictions at the same time as they imposed rules to kind of correct what they saw as trade imbalances. It kind of sought to level the playing field for trade with the U.S. So it still was very much in support of free trade, but it required other countries to also kind of play fair. Some of the areas in which the act, the provisions of the act covered were access to various markets, the expansion of U.S. imports, and the easing of barriers on imports. Now, an early multinational agreement around trade is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. Countries who signed the GATT agreement agreed that trade would be non-discriminatory, that protections should be limited. So they're trying to get people to back off on protectionism. Because left unrestrained, people always enact protectionism because the first person who does it, then everybody else is like, well, we're going to do it too. And that hurts everybody. So GATT was a way of getting all these countries together to say, hey, look, we're going to back off on protectionism for the common good. And then finally, that if you had a trade issue, you would resolve it by consultation. Effectively, you would talk it out instead of, as opposed to say maybe like the Opium Wars, which was essentially a series of armed conflicts between Great Britain and China over the sale of opium. Now, in 1995, GATT was replaced by the WTO. And the significant thing here is that the WTO is an organization. It's not just a treaty or an agreement. Some of the things that the WTO can do is, one is it's more permanent. As an organization, it kind of lives independent of just a treaty between countries. And it gives people a platform for resolving trade disputes. And we can talk about these other things, the GATS, TRIMS, and TRIPS. These were kind of middle ground steps in terms of trade agreements that ultimately led to the WTO. The WTO also essentially it sets out to make a fair playing field between its member countries and establish rules that everybody can agree to and live by on a universal basis. It also provides an independent forum for the hearing of disputes, and if you're a signatory to the WTO, then you've agreed to give it authority to issue a binding decision if you're in a trade dispute. Now, not everybody is a fan of the WTO. So there's some people who claim that the WTO is just a puppet of the bigger member countries like the United States, and that as a result, the disputes that happen between big countries and small countries are decided unfairly in favor of the big countries. And there's a lot of kinds of protests against globalization. We're in a really interesting time where globalization doesn't enjoy universal support, and protests against globalization range from peaceful, like you can see the sculpture on the left, to terrorism, to really not peaceful. And the picture on the right is the bombing of a double-decker bus in London. Now, we've talked a lot about different types of trade agreements. The biggest trade agreement that is at issue in our time is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP. This was put forward by President Obama. It's a big enough deal that the White House sent email to everybody and even designed a special logo for the TPP. In fact, they even put out a video about it. So you can see this is, a year and a half old, a little less than a year and a half old since the full text release. Here's the video put out by the government on the TPP.
This is a cherry. Well, this is no ordinary cherry. It's an American cherry. Homegrown and picked with love on a family farm in Washington State. Today, our cherry is getting ready to be enjoyed the world over. After all, the U.S. is one of the world's largest exporters of cherries. In fact, Americans grow and manufacture a lot of top-notch goods, like cars, music, and bacon, that people across the world want to buy. And that's important for our economy, because 95% of the world's consumers live outside our borders. And when they buy our Made in America products, they support better paying jobs for middle-class Americans here at home. So how do we get our cherry into their community markets? American cherries are packaged and transported to be sold abroad. But right now, our cherry, like most Made in America goods, face too many obstacles to make it to market. like the 10% tax on our Washington farmer's cherry if he wants to sell it in Vietnam. Meanwhile, cherries from Australian farmers will be sold in Vietnam with 0 taxes next year. That's where trade agreements can help. Right now, President Obama is working with Congress to secure his trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP. This trade agreement will write the rules so American workers can sell their goods to the fastest growing markets without being blocked or put at an unfair disadvantage. And that's the kind of deal that puts the American worker and the American cherry on top. The Trans-Pacific Partnership. More Made in America exports abroad, more good jobs here at home.
So congratulations, you have now been exposed to propaganda about the TPP. And I mean, what gives with those cherries made in Australia? I mean, that's crazy talk. Anyway, so the TPP is a big deal. It's currently, part of the conversation. One of the interesting things about the TPP is just how far-reaching it is. So here you can see these are all of the countries that are signatories to the TPP. You'll notice that conspicuously absent is the largest trading partner in the region, which is China. So there's a lot of kind of postulating that the TPP is a specific shot at China for China's trade policies and practices. Here are the number of existing agreements that would be swallowed up by the TPP. You can see they are not a few. And this is curious that both candidates in the recent presidential election were opposed to the TPP. And this is one of those things that Trump has said, look, as soon as I'm in office, we're rejecting the TPP. And all those countries who signed on to the TPP are a little hacked off about that. But the big takeaway here is that trade deals used to be about trade. The TPP is an example of one of these huge, far-reaching agreements. It's like here's some of the issues that it touches on. It touches on labor, touches on intellectual property and copyright issues, right? So the U.S. is kind of hostile on this to China because we make a lot of IP, we make a lot of software, we make movies. It has provisions about environmental issues, provisions about privacy and data issues, which is also interesting since the U.S. gets a lot of criticism for its spying on its own citizens. For instance, if you're selling software to Europe, you need to make sure that you are not using servers located in the U.S. that could be subject to U.S. spying from the NSA. So this covers some of those issues. And then foreign policy and domestic lawmaking issues. This is way beyond just a run-of-the-mill trade agreement. It's effectively, the TPP is to trade what Obamacare is to health insurance, or Dodd-Frank is to financial regulation. It's just a gigantic document with huge and far-reaching impact. Okay, that is the end of the lecture. What's up for next week? Here's a recap of things you need to know. Up for next week, Learn Smart chapters 3 and 4. Icebreaker peer feedback. So you did your icebreaker videos this week. Next week, log into, I think we had said at least 8 of your peers and leave comments. So get to know each other a little bit. The writing assignment for next week is a review of the podcast The Tiger and the Dragon. That's put out by A16Z, which is Andreessen Horowitz, which is a big venture capital firm. They are interested in how trade is working in India and China, so that podcast will give you some fun insights there. And then we'll keep going with our current events discussion on the Canvas discussion boards. With that said, we are done. See you next week.